Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation for the Catholic Leadership Summit 2021. This is entitled Leadership Formation for Catholic School Principals. Our intent in this presentation is to give you some great kind of content, some great information about how you can help first-year principals acclimate and orient to their schools. Introduce myself. My name is Kevin Baxter. I am currently the director for the Marianne Remick Leadership Program here at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to this role, I was actually at NCEA for 2 years as the Chief Innovation Officer. And prior to that, I served as superintendent in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles for 10 years. I've also been a Catholic school principal and teacher. I'll turn it over to Dr. Greg O'Donnell.
Thanks, Kevin. My name is Greg O'Donnell, and I'm currently the director of the Center for Transformational Educational Leadership here at the University of Notre Dame. It's a principal coaching program designed for early career principals to grow in their practice. I've been here at the University of Notre Dame for the past 9 years myself. So I was a teacher before coming here to work for ACE, and I've worked with all of our leadership programs from Notre Dame ACE Academies to our Marianne Remick Leadership Program to now taking over the Center for Transformational Educational Leadership. And it's just a pleasure to be with you all. We thought we'd just begin our time here as we do all things in prayer. And so we wanted to share this prayer with you all, which we use across the programs Kevin and I direct. It really embodies one of the beliefs we hold with our leadership programs here at the Alliance for Catholic Education. So we'll begin in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we are constant learners who seek to know you ever more fully. Inspire in us a thirst for knowledge. We're a community that transmits the values of our faith to all we meet. Grant us the grace to inspire in those around us a fervent desire to seek, persist, excel, love, and serve in all we do. And we are witnesses who seek to make God known, loved, and served every day. Give us eyes of faith that by learning more about the world and the people in it, we might come to see ever more clearly God in all things. Amen. So, Holy Spirit, amen. So just to situate our conversation here, we're going to talk through 3 domains that we use across both of our programs, but we really pull this a lot from a lot of the recent research. And if you're familiar with the Wallace report that came out this past year in 2021, it talks about really what is the influence that principals have on school and student outcomes. And it identifies 3 key areas of skills that we're going to break down how we use that in our formation programs, but we think is really essential for principals to consider in terms of what are the skills they have and what are those behaviors they engage in. You can see from this, it talks about how you engage with people and the idea of that human development and the relationship skills you have, to the instruction and those skills you use for teachers' classroom instruction, and the organization, and how you can really think more creatively about that resource allocation and how you manage the school. And it really should be focused on those 4 key leadership behaviors that will really have the greatest influence that principals can have when we start, because I think it's really relevant. But we're going to talk through first this idea of school culture and how do principals focus on those skills of designing a Christ-centered school culture in their schools, how they are the instructional leadership and how they really are that leader and that lead learner for their schools. Then also the idea of the executive management of how do they manage those operations of the school in diligent and creative and innovative ways. But we know too, in terms of that context in Catholic schools, we can't forget the faith leadership aspect. It's important for principals to both nurture that themselves so they can then nurture it in others as well. So we'll use that as a frame as we talk through our slides here.
So we're going to start with school culture, and with every one of these domains, we're going to lead with an essential question just to get us thinking about what we're trying to define. And so our essential question is, how do transformational leaders build an intentional, coherent Catholic school culture that makes God known, loved, and served, and model this through their own spiritual leadership? And culture is the lead domain that we want to speak to today, because this is foundational to everything you want to accomplish as a new principal at a school. All of the aims and vision and direction and where you want to go with the school, you need to make sure that you've got that culture established and that culture formed in order to achieve many of those goals. So some definitions of culture, and you might have heard this. Sometimes you've heard the simplistic definition of culture is the way we do things around here, right? It's really that environment with which the school operates. So some of these definitions, set of norms, values, and meanings, right? What the community itself, and that's represented by teachers and parents and students. It's represented by clergy. Really, how do you define those norms, values, and meanings? You share basic assumptions, right? What are your expectations in terms of student learning? What are your expectations in terms of the populations that you're serving? Culture helps to frame a way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to problems that you need to solve. So when problems arise, do you have a constructive culture that sees that as an opportunity to solve that problem? Or do you have a culture maybe that's more negative and that feels defeated by those problems? And finally, we tell stories and we have traditions and we have rituals. This is particularly important in Catholic schools that have such rich histories with religious orders, perhaps, that founded the schools, with charisms that go back generations. Really knowing those stories and those traditions, because they're the foundation and frame for your current culture. So as a new principal coming in, you want to make sure that you're familiar with that history, familiar with those stories and traditions, because even though you might be coming new into the school, you can build upon that history to really form and shape that culture moving forward.
As Kevin said, I think the intentionality here of like, what is that preferred future you want to define for your school? And as you think through this, I think there's 3 levels of culture you want to think through intentionally as you structure this, and you get to really craft what are those messages you want to have there. And I give the example here of a tree. If you look on the right, and it's going to flip what you look at the text on the left, but the idea of the roots are really, what is that basic underlying assumptions? What are those unconscious or taken for granted beliefs and values that every individual in the school holds? And how do you craft those and make those collective, such that individuals can buy into those and they know that this is the culture we're creating here at the school, and this is why we do what we really believe we should do in our schools, because this is why we're here. This is the mission that drives us together. That then flows through that trunk and those branches, the idea of the espoused beliefs and values. What are those ideals, those goals, or those values, any of those aspirations, those things that you make really visible in the community, that are things that are easy to hold on to, but they really are strong in a way that can center the whole community around, this is what's important to us, and here's what we're striving to do collectively. And ultimately, it comes in the form of those artifacts. And this is really where you get to measure the culture and see it most clearly, because it's hard to see those roots, those underlying assumptions, unless you take the time to talk about it. And those values, while you can state them, it's not until you get to the artifacts that you start to see how this culture comes alive in your school. And that's those visible or feelable structures or processes, the observed behaviors, the leaves on the tree. It's what you see in that example of those stories that you tell. It's the artifacts you have around the walls of your school that really remind students and teachers, this is what we are about here in this community. It's important to keep that in mind as you craft your culture in your school. I think I give this example here. If you think about, Kevin mentioned the religious who used to really run our schools, but we know that today we rely more on this image on the right, the idea of these lay individuals who really run our schools. When you think about that same framework, you can imagine that those beliefs that were underlying and just assumed 50 years ago were very clear. They shared a very similar charism. They shared very similar beliefs to the formation they had, but we know that today, that's not the same reality. We know that today we need to, one, focus on the Catholic formation in the ecclesial to make sure that our lay ministers are ecclesial ministers of our communities, and they're recognizing that faith aspect of the Catholic uniqueness of our schools, but also that you take time to share those values, because they're oftentimes different that each of the teachers bring to them, because they haven't been formed in the same way. They may come from different states, different schools, different universities, and just centers of formation that they've come through. And so you have to take the time to craft that collectively as a community, as the leader of your school. In terms of just a few tips to think about as you go about crafting this, I think first is just making sure it's authentically Catholic. We know that it's the unique blessing of our schools that we get to advocate that we are authentically Catholic, and allows us to operate in different ways. But to do so, we have to know how to craft that message and what that means. And I can't urge enough just to rely on the idea of the Gospels and our Catholic faith tradition to inform that desired culture you're creating. We know the Gospels give us so many stories of love, mercy, belonging, justice. All these different themes that we hear Jesus tell us of are great examples to bring alive, because that's really what we're trying to create in our schools. We're trying to create that kingdom of God alive in the communities we serve, and tapping into the Gospels and the other incarnations of the church are just great ways to do so. I think second and foremost, it's really important to consider the idea that it's a collaborative culture. This can't just be something that you, from the top of the school, as the leader who's most visible to the community, is saying, here's what we're doing, if the teachers don't buy into this as well. And you have to take time to make sure this is a collaborative process where you engage teachers, students, family, the staff, other community members, to realize that together we are better together. And if they have a voice in this culture, and if you're listening to their feedback and involving them in having ownership of this culture, it'll be a stronger culture in your school as well. And finally, I just leave with the idea that it should be experiential as well. We need to realize that you can't just tell individuals this is the culture we desire. You have to get them to realize you can see it and feel it rather than just thinking about it. And this is where you can craft experiences for individuals, from how you manage your faculty and staff, to how you engage with students every day, to how you engage with families and other members of the community. And you can create and cultivate experiences that intentionally create joy in those families. Because if we don't want our Catholic schools to be joyful places, and I leave the quote here from Pope Francis in The Joy of the Gospel, that the gospel radiant with the glory of Christ's cross constantly invites us to rejoice. And if we as leaders can think through how we can create positive, joyful moments with our communities, they can experience that joy too, which is one way to make them experience that unique Catholic nature of our schools. As you think about engaging with culture, I think we'd be remiss not to mention too that you have to take the time yourself to cultivate yourself as a spiritual leader. If you're going to be that leader who's cultivating and bringing this culture alive in your schools, you too have to take time to nurture your own garden and make sure that you're growing in your own spiritual faith to be able to do that for others. And so we offer 5 tenets here to think about, which really follows this framework of thinking upward, thinking of God first, then inward, how you cultivate this in your heart, and how you live this out outwardly among others. So this idea of just first making sure you spend time yourself to form yourself as a person of prayer. A Catholic school leader can't be that leader of the community in a Catholic way if they themselves don't engage in prayer themselves and cultivate that own faith life. You also have to foster liturgical awareness, making sure you're aware of those tenets of the church so that it is in alignment with what our church teaching is, and we really want to make sure our schools are perpetuating in the evangelization they provide to our communities. Making sure you understand church documents and those teachings related to Catholic education. And again, more you rely on those gospels, you can tap into those stories and those communications you make and the way you perpetuate the culture and communicate that to the community. You can help ground that in the church teachings and other faith-based practices. Finally, you should deepen your self-awareness, and by doing so, you can then lean into vulnerability to share your own personal witness with others, to invite them in to similarly share their own faith and to grow deeper in that faith through their own spiritual journey.
Some practical applications. We talk, this whole idea of culture, and we can talk a lot about the theory of the culture, and how does this really look day to day for a first-year principal who's trying to establish a positive Catholic culture within the school. First is really the leader's role. The leader really does set the tone in terms of how this has to happen. And I've told principals in the past when I've worked with them, this might not be fair, but the fact is how you go is how the tone of your school will go. How you lead and how you kind of dictate the mood of the day and the mood even of the month or the school year, because people are going to take their keys from how you act. So establishing that culture, things like faculty morning prayer, making sure that the principal prioritizes that time. If you have morning faculty prayer that maybe is optional and some faculty come and some don't, the principal showing up every single day to that will really help demonstrate how important that is to the life of the school and life of the faculty within the school. Being really intentional in terms of your signage, depending on where you're situated, and making sure that those signage and the iconography and all of those things at the school are really clear about it's a Catholic school. That helps to inform visitors and inform even the students and the parents on a daily basis the reason for the school. Being thoughtful about programs to support parents as the primary educators of their own children. And so working closely with the pastor, for example, to say, how can we can help inform parents and catechize parents almost to help make sure they have supports in their work to educate their own children in the faith. And I think about the wonders of a Catholic school really is that we integrate the faith through everything that we do. So how students are disciplined. Students are going to make mistakes. This is inevitable. We as adults make mistakes every single day. But when students make mistakes, we can bring the Paschal mystery into it and talk about how we fall, and then we ask for redemption, and then we're forgiven, and we move on, trying to do better next time. We really integrate that into how we think about that with students. We can talk about that in terms of how we work with our faculty, how coaches work with students on their teams, and how they want to make sure they're talking in a positive way and really utilizing the language of our faith in terms of how they work with students and coach students. There's a great quote from Sister Helen Prejean: "I watch what I do to see what I believe." The culture really is that water that we swim in throughout the school, and the leader's role is really to ensure that their example and their integrity is first and foremost, so that the entire school community can lead off that.
So just building off of the idea of focusing on Catholic culture, making sure there's an authentically Catholic one that you can be the spiritual leader of, We're moving into this next frame of instructional leadership, which we know that our schools are first and foremost places of learning. And so that leader's role as the instructional leader is really important to consider as we go into this next frame. And so the essential question for this that we look at is, how do I, as the principal, ensure student learning when I'm no longer teaching in the classroom? We know that for many individuals, it's difficult to make that jump because you love working with the students so much and you lose that interaction with them when you move to that principal role. In the same way, you don't get to spend every day and every moment of the day with those students in the classrooms, but you still can have a huge influence on student learning. And so through this frame, we talk about how does that role of instructional leader play out, and how can you start to think about your teachers as your students, and now you can still cultivate those interactions with students in the school as well through this lever of making sure all the school is unified and aligned in the way they're supporting student learning.
As much as we talk about instructional leadership and the importance of that, what we want to make sure principals understand is they do not need to be the, capital V, instructional leader. And that's a variety of reasons for that. First and foremost, the role of the principal has greatly expanded over time. I was a principal first in 2001, and just even since that time, the amount of duties that a principal is responsible for have dramatically increased and shifted. You think about social media, and you think about data, and a lot of different things that principals have to focus on each and every day. So that time is really a challenge sometimes, and so we have to think about that. Also, when you're thinking about it in terms of instructional leadership, sometimes that can be narrow. If you see yourself as the instructional leader, are you neglecting other aspects of your job? Are you focusing, too narrowly on that area? Is it tedious? Or you're just thinking about checklists, so you're checking to make sure teachers have their lesson plans in, or you're going through for a walkthrough and you're just checking certain behaviors. And then also really feeling like if oftentimes I know principals will feel guilty that they're not in classrooms enough, or they're not seeing enough teachers frequently enough. And how can they offer insight to teachers who are teaching different content areas? And just that whole sense of being the instructional leader on site can sometimes cause us to feel like we're not being as effective as we would like to be. So the language we like to use is a lead learner, why we believe that principals should be the lead learner in their school. First, it really does make the work meaningful intrinsically. It talks about the fact that we lead learning environments. And when we're a lead learner, it obviously implies that we're also with a group of other learners. And so we're working with peers more than subordinates, if you will. And we're trying to guide that learning for all of those who work at the school. The lead learner models learning, because you can share with faculty best practices and how to do things and how to lead that learning within the classroom. It helps to really think about this in terms of shaping the conditions for all to learn. So you're not necessarily thinking about specifics with regard to every teacher in every single subject area, but you're shaping those conditions for those teachers to continually develop themselves professionally on an ongoing basis. Obviously, you want to foster that professional capital of teachers and their capacity, and you want to make sure that they're increasing in their knowledge and in their practice on a year-to-year basis. And then this lead learner concept also really talks about a collaborative culture and capacity building. And that collaboration is something that we think is very, very important, especially for first-year principals to understand that this is not a solitary enterprise. You can't go in and think about this is your role to do. You have to rely on others in all different domains, in all different areas. And that collaborative culture that you want to establish can be really, really effective when you're thinking about it from an instructional leadership perspective.
So just to visualize this idea of the lead learner, when you think about your leadership of the learning that happens in the school community, think of these two key levers. I would say the idea of beliefs and systems. And if you go back to our slides where we talked about culture and what are those underlying assumptions, the lead learner, you can really drive that understanding of what are the collective beliefs we hold as a community in terms of student learning, and how do we live those out? And those should then shape the systems that you create to support the learning that's happening in your school. So for example, you might have a belief about student learning, that might shift a grading policy. So you might create a system for your school that's based on those beliefs on how you believe students learn. And those systems then are what bring to life those beliefs. So this is a mutual system when you think about the way you can have really effective changes being the lead learner, you think about, you can guide that direction you have and name that really culture that you want for excellence in your school. But also then you can think about and craft those systems you have in place to see whether they reflect those beliefs, and also to make sure that they do so inherently, so that students are benefiting from the structures and processes you put in place in your school. I mentioned here this idea of this cultural shift, and I think we know that, as Kevin mentioned, we want to honor teachers' practice, and teachers have really been formed to be teachers, and so they're really good at teaching. One of the things I often see when I go into schools and work with our CTEL leaders, there's often a culture of teaching that is placed in our schools, and this may not be the case in your school, but we really encourage a shift to this idea of a culture for learning. And how do we take the emphasis away from not what teachers are doing, but ultimately what is it that students are able to do as a result of the instruction they receive in the classroom? So we can really focus on trying to push teachers away from this idea of it's not just what you do in the classroom, that's really important to consider. But what we measure at the end of the day is what students are learning. And so how can teachers make the connection between their actions and how that really impacts student performance in the school? And I recommend just thinking through this idea of how you can shift the culture from that one of instruction and teaching into one more based on what is happening in terms of learning in the community. With this, we offer this framework of focusing on what are some core instructional practices and how might you as the leader now provide tiered support to your teachers. And so I think everyone here is probably familiar with the idea of MTSS, where there's multi-tiered systems of supports for students. And you can really translate this to the same way you'd support your teachers. Know that the majority of your teachers are going to respond to ongoing collective capacity building and feedback. You can use those meetings you have with your teachers, those professional development sessions, to really make sure you have a collective capacity around what matters most. Within this, we'd recommend you consider what are those core instructional practices in place, ensuring that, because we know that students, 80% of students will respond well if you're meeting those core instructional practices of making sure you have clear, manageable, measurable, standards-based objectives, that teachers are using frequent, transparent checks for understanding to ensure that student learning is happening and to gather data around what is happening in the classroom, and also making sure that teachers provide multiple scaffolded opportunities to achieve mastery through guided practice. This really should be the focus of a lot of the time you spend to build that collective capacity among your teachers. But then as you think about your time as an instructional leader beyond that PD, you can then start to use targeted coaching and really intensive support for teachers who maybe are first years to your school, maybe they're new to the community and they aren't aware of the culture and the expectations you have. And so you want to familiarize them with that structure. And those are teachers where it's worth spending your time more on targeted coaching and that heavier investment of support to them, knowing that all of your teachers are going to respond through that strong culture of collaboration around those key practices you want to institute in your schools. You can then focus on intensive support for those teachers who maybe aren't responding well to feedback or really are struggling in the classroom. And you can focus really laser point of your time on those teachers to ensure that all students are able to learn by supporting all of your teachers in this robust way.
So for first year principals especially, it's really important to get into the habit and start to think about ways to build a culture that's continuously going to improve upon itself. And so you want to make sure that how you view the work, and this is really in all areas, but for instructional leadership especially, how are you thinking about ongoing improvement? And you want to build it, and so you have these incremental cycles of professional growth where you're making progress and you have a process in place where you can look at these things in an intentional way on a regular basis. So you can identify the focus, and this could be driven a lot if you're going through accreditation or you have another type of process that you're focused on, or if you just want to focus on different areas of the curriculum year to year and try to really drill down deeply into each one over time. So you'd identify the focus. You want to build shared understanding of what that focus is. Obviously across grade levels, across different faculty levels, create collective commitments. And so you can think about this in terms of, if you're in an elementary school, thinking about it in grade bands, and how are you talking about that articulation from different grade bands in terms of those collective commitments you're making to one another. And then implementing those collective commitments. So that's kind of the implementation phase, and then you're collecting that corresponding data. And then the final part of that cycle is really to analyze that data, so then you inform the next step. And so this becomes a cycle, because as you analyze that data, you will help then create that next area of focus, and that cycle becomes ongoing. And that cycle then leads to this culture that's going to continuously be thinking about how do we do better for students, and to ensure that our students are going to be continually learning while they're at our school. And this vision for excellence too. I think one of the key things, there's a little line from Alice in Wonderland up in the upper right-hand corner. One day Alice came to a fork in the road and saw a Cheshire cat in a tree. "Which road do I take?" she asked. "Where do you want to go?" was his response. "I don't know," Alice answered. "Then," said the cat, "it doesn't matter." That's intended to communicate is language is important, and we really want to know directionally, and that's a vision when we think about how we want to think about it in school terms. We want to have that vision, and having common language and knowing where you want to go is very, very important. As a first-year principal, you have opportunities to do this. You have opportunities to really underscore professional dialogue, understanding and nurturing communication among your faculty, really ensuring that there's consistency across grade levels, across different subject areas that helps to facilitate student learning. You want to foster a shared responsibility and a connected autonomy, how we're not autonomous in our own individual classrooms. We can think about that connected autonomy in terms of how we're ensuring students are learning, again, across subject areas, across grade levels. Accelerate adult learning by organizing and connecting practices, increasing teacher motivation and commitment. And all of this leads to deeper knowledge and also reduces stress for teachers. And so this vision of excellence, as a first-year principal, sometimes you think about things you have to prioritize and where you want to spend your time. But it's important to, again, collaboratively really think about this directionality in terms of where do you want to go in terms of your faculty, in terms of your school community, and then help to put those systems in place where you can build that collaboration among the faculty to move toward that vision.
So we'll move into our final domain here. We talk about the idea of executive management, or really all those operational functions that you have to focus on as a leader of a school as well. And so our central question for guiding this, we talk about how do diligent, creative, and entrepreneurial leaders achieve the mission of their school through effective organizational management and board governance. So recognize this really embodies a lot of different facets of the job. But I love the phrase here and how the juxtaposition of the idea of diligent, creative, and entrepreneurial. We often can focus on the constraints our schools are facing, whether it be budgetary or just other situational ones within the context where our school is situated. But as leaders, we're really called to be diligent, creative, and entrepreneurial in ways that we think about how can we lead our schools differently. And we won't spend as much time talking about board governance or organizational management, but recognizing what are all those systems in play from the archdiocese to your individual boards, or maybe it's an institution that runs your school if you're not a diocesan school. Recognizing all of those different players at stake and those stakeholders that you're involved with and you engage with as the leader, and how can you be diligent, creative, and entrepreneurial in the way that you lead to take your school into that preferred future that you define.
And we know, I think especially for first-year principals, sometimes the executive management domain might be the one where you've got the most concerns. You know, you've been a teacher in the classroom and you feel strong in the Catholic identity and how you're going to lead faith formation. You understand teaching and you understand instruction, but then you have to manage things and think about it from an administrative perspective. And that can feel a little bit overwhelming to people who haven't been through that before. There's a wonderful book called Redeeming Administration by Anne Garrido that kind of highlights the ministerial aspect of administration. And it's a short book, and it really short kind of chapters, and could be a great resource for, especially for principals who are early in their terms, to really appreciate the value of administration and why it's so important. She opens that book with a quote: "The ministry is in the interruption." And those of you who've started leading schools and know how leadership works is, I sometimes call that by the death by 1,005 minutes, because someone will just keep popping in and saying, "You got 5 minutes, you got 5 minutes, you got 5 minutes." And before you know it, the day is gone. But some other things from the book that really speak to this, she talks about taking it one day at a time is a wonderful adage to hear, but sometimes multiple days attack all at once. We think about effective administration is really all about trust. It's trusting others, it's trusting ourselves, and it's trusting God. And finally talks about one individual who really mastered this. He seemed to have developed the capacity to sleep through storms. And the piece about administration that I think is really, really important is good leaders maintain kind of an even keel, regardless if things get too high or too low. They try not to overreact to things, and they try to maintain that even keel. That's easier said than done, speaking from firsthand experience. So I know that's a challenge, But I think that's one of the aspects that we want to make sure first-year principals really appreciate, is that you don't want to kind of go to those extremes when things happen, because keeping yourself calm and your sense kind of on that even keel will help to clear your head and make the best decisions you can make. Some of these contrasts we sometimes hear, are paradoxes we'll hear. We hear leadership versus management, or leadership is sometimes held up as an ideal, and maybe management is not seen negatively, but it's not as flashy maybe as leadership. And I think what we want to communicate with the executive management domain is that both of these are very, very important to being a successful Catholic school principal. Leadership is strategic. It can set vision. It can kind of set direction and help motivate and inspire people to move in a certain direction. And that's wonderful. The management side really is about how do you, run things, and how do you manage the human resource function? How do you manage finances? How do you manage buildings and capital and all of these different areas? And so both those pieces are very, very important in order for a principal to be successful at a school. For Catholic school principals, what's really wonderful to think about, and that's what the design really has here, the circular design, is our mission, vision, and values are at the center of everything that we do. So we always want to have that at the core of our beliefs and kind of what motivates us and what drives us. And then on that outward red circle, immediately after that, we have mission measurement, we have board governance and strategic planning. Some of those leadership functions that we talk about, right? How do we think about those things with that mission, vision, and values at our core? And on the outer ring, we start to think about more of maybe the process-oriented management tools in terms of human capital management, institutional advancement, school finance, school law and education policy, facilities and operations management. This circle is really designed to say that, especially for us in Catholic schools, the mission, vision, and values drive everything. And we want to make sure that we hold to those values when we're planning budgets, when we're thinking about staffing needs, when we're thinking about all of these management functions should be guided and should be driven by our mission, vision, and values within that Catholic school. One of the things too to think about is that this 21st century Catholic school principal, and these are some of the things that we think are really, really important for principals today to embrace, and some characteristics they have to exhibit. One is being entrepreneurial, right? We think about that word sometimes with business and maybe being someone who would set up on and take some risks and open a business or do something along those lines. But Catholic school principals have to think in an entrepreneurial way today, because especially in some schools and maybe many schools where you have struggles with various issues. It could be enrollment, it could be finances, it could be a number of things. To think creatively in terms of how we can set up that school is one of the gifts about being a Catholic school principal. There is some autonomy to make those decisions. Now, you want to make sure those are community-based, that you're listening to the community and you're working with the community, and that they're anchored in data, because you don't want to just kind of make decisions without having a really good frame in terms of what the reality is. But you can use that autonomy to take risks and to innovate. And Catholic school principals really need to think this way today if we want to grow Catholic schools and really sustain them for future generations. The importance of interpersonal relationships, and this is an important characteristic to highlight here for executive management, because we might think about this in terms of instructional leadership or even building school culture, but interpersonal relationships are vitally important. If you're a principal, obviously you have a relationship with your pastor, maybe a relationship with the superintendent, relationship with your teachers and parents, relationship with parishioners, and obviously students. Those relationships are key. If you have a board, obviously knowing those board members who have potential knowledge or talents that they can share that help the school, really working those relationships, building those relationships so that they can help best support the school. We have a lot of access to data today, especially moving to more digital tools in terms of instruction, in terms of data collection. But analyzing that data, I think, is also very, very important. And we want to make sure we're looking at that data from consistent sources. Now, if you're in a diocese maybe that does some of this, they might have those sources already identified for you. So if they're collecting budgets, you might have some budget records that you can go back and look at. If they have instructional plans, if they have faith formation plans for the faculty, you can go back and look at those. One of the initial tasks that's really helpful for a new principal is to kind of go back and audit these sources of data, to look at all of these staff evaluations, to look at budget, to look at faith formation program. And then you get a really good, strong sense of where the school is. You know its strengths, and you know maybe areas where it has the capacity to grow. And then once you get that assessment of the true state of the school, you can start to build ongoing capacity and accountability to use that data to bring improvement to all aspects of the school. And then finally, I think one of the pieces about being a Catholic school principal, and this is not unlike being a Catholic school teacher in some ways, but that we can sometimes feel isolated and we can feel alone in our work. And so utilizing network support to be able to connect with mentors, perhaps you're assigned a mentor by your diocese, and if you're not, maybe trying to find a mentor, a veteran principal perhaps, who you can work with and ask questions and meet with regularly to kind of go through questions and challenges that you might be faced with. You also ideally can create a network or find a network with other first-year principals, and even just meeting regularly with them. And one of the gifts of the last year, we've had a painful last year, but one of the gifts is really being able to access on Zoom regular time to engage with our colleagues. And so even if you're not geographically close to your fellow first-year principals, being able to engage once a month or so to problem solve, to build support, to talk through challenges, that network support can be very, very important for you.
So hopefully I think this is all great, but you might also be wondering, I often hear this from principals I work with saying, how do I handle all of this in my day? We know there's only 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week. And I offer two frames, because I think part of the executive management domain is really thinking about how do you manage yourself? And I love these two frames. One image on the left side, you have the whirlwind. And I pulled this from the 4 Disciplines of Execution, which is a great book about how to focus on the wildly important. But you know that in the management function, you can't get rid of those day-to-day tasks. You have to make sure you submit payroll so that teachers can get paid, or you're not going to have teachers in your school. You have to make sure you take the time to filter in all those processes and follow up on all those 5-minute interruptions that happen. But you can't let yourself be consumed by that whirlwind. And so how can you think about your time and say, how can I carve out 10, 15, 20% of my time in a week just to focus on those things that are the most important to my school, those strategic elements, knowing that you're going to be consumed in that time for those interruptions where the ministry is. But if you want to make progress moving forward, you have to focus on what's essential. And on the right, I offer a focus here of how do you focus your time? And this can be different in each of the schools you're in. Some of you may be blessed to be in schools where you have a large leadership team with you. You may be in a small school where it's just you and you have just a secretary or an admin working with you, and the rest has to fall to you. And so to think about each of those tasks you have to engage in a day, and how can you go through and see what is the most essential to work on? And if you put it through this idea of this funnel, what are those tasks you can eliminate? Because they're just not essential. Might be essential in the long term, but it's not essential right now to make an impact on my school community. Or which ones can you find a process to automate so you don't have to spend your time processing that every single day where it takes up more of your time? Or can you delegate it? Is there someone where you can just kind of say, I don't need to do this myself? And now I know this is going back to Kevin's point of you have to trust individuals. This can be tough to do, especially as you move into the role of principal, but what are those things where you can find opportunities to empower others by taking on those tasks to really distribute the wealth and distribute the leadership of the school to increase that buy-in and collaboration among your community, but also to free up your time to focus on what's most important for the school that only you can move forward as the principal. And going through this structure, I found it really helpful to think about what can I focus on right now so I'm not just getting overwhelmed by that whirlwind in the day-to-day of all these different things I have to focus on. Going back to that outer frame that Kevin shared a minute ago, I think in terms of executive management, the content that you cover, and you've all taken classes on this, you don't need to be told what it is again, but when you think about budget planning, school law, and even human resources, that really you have to be familiar in this. You have to know enough to be dangerous about all of these things. And you can delegate these tasks of operations, but you can't delegate the responsibilities. So you have to create structures and systems in place so that you're keeping an eye on this and moving this forward and really providing the strategic vision for your school in each of these areas. But where are areas you can maybe purge and delegate some of that work that you have yourself, while you can still make sure the responsibility is going to fall on you as the leader of the school, and you can ensure that's moving forward. And you have to make sure you're aware about all those processes as you move forward. I can't stress enough how important it is to work with your archdiocese. They're there to help support you in this manner, and knowing that they are going to be there, they're going to have a legal team who can help you. They're going to have systems in place for how you can work with budgets or hiring of individuals. And these are great. Times you may have to work outside of these if you can't get individuals to come work for your school. So you have to still know that responsibility is yours, but you can find those systems to help support you in that, so you aren't doing this alone. In this way, you have to know how to acquire and mobilize resources. I go back to that frame, that essential question of being diligent. How can you think about this in entrepreneurial ways and leverage them for the greatest impact for your schools without just spinning the wheels so you feel like you're spending all your time without any impact on your school? To this, as Kevin mentioned, you have to make sure success is measured by mission attainment. It can be easy to fall into that task list of, I can achieve all of this today. But at the end of the day, we're not measuring our leadership by how efficient we were in the operation of our schools or what those financial returns were for our school, but really by that mission attainment of how we impacted those individuals around us. And we have to be mindful. We can't just disregard the budget and know that we're going to run in the red every single year, because that won't work in the long term. So you have to keep an eye on that, but you have to know how to make decisions that will advance the mission of your school. And really this idea that the school demonstrates what it values through your leadership by how you spend money or how you implement policies. And keep this in mind, that pastoral dimension of what we're all called to do as Catholic school leaders. Now, first and foremost, we try and build this culture that is authentically Catholic, but that's lived out through those norms of how we act and how we norm expectations for our community as well.
So in closing, all of these domains really speak to this idea of building a culture of continuous improvement. I have a belief that Catholic schools really should be on this path to greatness. Greatness is not an endpoint, it's an ongoing challenge. And so whatever you've achieved up to this point, it's just, that's your baseline, and you want to continually try to improve upon your past performance. And so this is a model from Brick, Gomez, and Grunau about Plan, Do, Study, Act. PDSA sometimes is referred to, and it's simply a way to think about building that culture. You want to think about it in terms of data sources to effectively plan and set an improvement goal. Now, this could be within managing resources, it could be within the instructional realm, it could be within the faith formation Catholic identity realm. But in managing resources, it really helps you to think and prioritize the area that might need the most attention at this point. We also really want to rely on our networks, because we know that research in the field can help develop an intervention and implement it, and then study and revise. Through that collective process, we build collective knowledge, and we can all share that knowledge and better identify ways to move forward in a really positive and constructive way. And all of this really comes back to the mission of our Catholic schools and how we can fully execute that mission. We want to be on a path to greatness so that we know we're preparing students for college and for heaven. And we want to make sure that our work is always focused on that ideal, that we want to build a faith-filled community that is rigorous in its academic outcomes, and that maintains its management of the resources available to it in an effective and efficient way.
I want to close by saying thank you. There's a number of resources, and we won't read through these. We'll just page through them, and you can look at them on the slide deck as well. There's a number of resources that help inform this presentation, or just great places to look if you're saying, how do I start with this? If you want to dig in more. So a couple on school culture, on faith leadership, if you're looking to develop your own self, your own spiritual leadership. You have instructional leadership if you want to focus on that area and your own growth, or even those around executive management. Just close by just saying thank you. I want to give a huge thanks, especially to our teams on the Remick Leadership Program and the Center for Transformational Educational Leadership, for helping us to pull these resources together for this presentation. And we just encourage you to reach out if we can be of help to any of you in your schools or your diocese as you engage in this work.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you all for joining us. And again, just to highlight, please reach out if you have any questions, and we can be supportive of you in any way. Thanks very much.
God bless.